Hello my lovelies! My name is Gilbert Dolthalion and the plan for today is to make a mask. Yes, I know I'm about 2 months late on this, but hear me out. Lots of people did fantastic mask videos back at the beginning of all of this, some of which I'm going to link down below, back when our biggest concern was lack of resources for our medical staff. This is still a massive problem, and anyone out there who's still making masks or scrubs or 3D printing parts, anything to help out, is a fantastic human and should be really proud of what they've done. But now that a lot of places are starting to open up again, most of them are starting to require masks, especially in enclosed public spaces. Here in Germany, for example, if we don't wear a mask on public transport or in shops, we can be fined. So what does this change? Well, up until this point, masks were not recommended in most places for healthy individuals. This means suddenly millions of people that weren't wearing masks before are now needing to wear masks on a daily basis. I've already started to see single-use masks dumped on the street here and it drives me up the wall. The realization is starting to grow that the new normal is not going to be like the old normal, and for a lot of us it's going to require masks on a daily basis. And we, as the costume community, tend to be fairly conscientious about reuse and making things to last and all of those lovely things that don't end up with single-use masks being left all over the street. A lot of the videos that I've seen so far have been about mass production, about grinding out masks to get them to as many people who need them as possible. And there's nothing wrong with this, and in fact it's still necessary. But by the nature of speed and mass production, even mass production done at home, a lot of them lack finishings or fittings in a way that, while still much more reusable than single-use masks, stop them from perhaps becoming a part of our everyday wardrobe in that way. So what I'm going to show you are 2 masks, one today and one in 2 weeks, that have a little bit more of that finishing, that are intended for you to make for yourself and maybe your friends and your family, so they can still be made in batches but not so quickly in so many big batches, that hopefully do have that rewearability and that flexibility that means that they will just become an everyday item of wear. The one I'm making today is reversible, so you can pick out 2 of your favourite prints or coordinate it with 2 different outfits. But enough talking, let's get to the sewing. The first step for both masks is to pick out a material. There's a lot of resources out there covering this, and the same applies to all types of masks, so I'm not going to cover it in detail here. I'm using 100% cotton, and because it's a fairly thin one, I'm using a thicker piece of cotton to flatline it. Use your judgment on this. Obviously, the thicker it is, the more protective, but the harder to sew. Cotton's great because it can be washed in a 60-degree wash to disinfect it, but I don't want to run a 60 wash every day. So to check that I could sterilise it, I cut 2 matching samples of each fabric and what I was using to tie it, and boiled them to check that it would survive this. But this is optional, especially if your family is large enough that you're going to be doing daily 60 washes anyway. My pattern is based off the Patty Doof pattern, which you'll find linked below, but I've adjusted it to make it reversible, so I'll post my own pattern below as well. There's 3 sizes, large, medium and small, with small designed for teenagers. Small is an average woman's size and large is an average men's size. And whichever size you'll pick, you'll need to cut at least 4 pieces, 2 of each fabric you want for the outside, and then another 2 if you're going to flatline in your flatlining fabric. The curved line is the centre seam, which travels down the middle of the face, which makes this mask extremely hard to pattern match. So I'd recommend going for a pattern that's either striped or too busy to match. With stripes, you might want to cut individual pieces to make sure that they match perfectly, but do make sure that you cut a left and a right piece. I'm feeling risky, and I've worked with this fabric before in a different colourway, so I'm going to make sure that the stripes are lined up on both sides, and then just cut the 2 at once. Remember to mark the notches, especially the 4 on the side, They'll make your life easier later, and keep the pairs together, especially if you're doing multiples and you want to keep your pattern matched pieces together, or you're doing multiple sizes. When you cut the pieces for the flat lining, you can draw a line between the two innermost notches and not cut that piece, as you don't need it and it'd be easier to sew without it. If you're going to flatline, pick one of your fashion fabrics to be flatlined. I recommend picking the one that's easier to pattern match. You can tack the lining pieces to it, but the seam allowances on this are fairly narrow and they'll be attached fairly quickly, so I find it easier just to pin them in place. Pin your pieces into two pairs along the curved front seam. And sew them on a 7mm seam allowance. My machine foot makes a good guide for this, but I don't know if that's the case for all machines. The seams will need to be clipped to lie flat, but only to about halfway down, and once that's done you can press them open. This seam is a bit of a pain to press because of the curve, but I managed to find an angle on my tailor's ham that works. If you don't have a tailor's ham, try using a tea towel to pat it out instead. Now it's time to bring your two pairs together. They need to be joined on the top and bottom. Try and keep the seam allowance from the middle seam evened out so it doesn't make bulk. You only want to sew to the innermost notch on both the top and the bottom, so if you're interlining, this makes a really good reminder to stop there, but you might want to put a pin in another direction in any case to remind you not to go further, which I definitely haven't done. The good news is, if you do sew too far, it's only 2cm to seam rip, so not so bad. You want to sew those seams on a 1cm seam allowance. The open ends also need to either be serged or zigzag stitched to protect them from fraying, so if you haven't done that already, get that out of the way now. Pressing these two seams is also a bit of a pain in the arse unless you happen to have one of those fancy sleeve pressers, which I do not, but it needs to be done anyway. They're not too long at least, so you can get away without too many creases pressed in where they shouldn't be, and these seams are going to be top stitched in place pretty soon anyway. But before that, the ends of the channel need to be turned up. These are the 2cm gaps between the seams that you just did and the end of your fabric. They need to be folded up to match the seam allowance of the top and bottom seam, and sewn with a fairly narrow hem so it matches the top stitching in the next step. After pressing, they should more or less stay in the right place anyway, but you can put a pin in if you want to secure them. This is just to keep the raw edge in place inside the cording channel, so you can serge or zigzag stitch them before as well if you want a little bit of extra protection. After that's done, fold in the sides to make a channel, folding on the outside notch so the zigzagged edge should meet up with the innermost one or your lining. Pin that in place, and then it's time for top stitching. I like to pin all the way around first so that I can make sure that the fabric isn't rolling forward or back, but staying on the side that it's meant to be, and that the seam is properly open given my ad hoc pressing. The first round of top stitching goes all the way around top and bottom, but turns 1 centimetre from the end on the sides where the channels are, so that they don't get sewn closed and form the innermost side of the channel. If your sewing isn't particularly precise, you might want to sew closer to 1.5 centimetres out to make sure that there's enough space for everything. With that line of top stitching done, hopefully without your bobbin running out like mine, you have just 2 lines more of stitching to go, closing up the channels on either end. These 2 lines need to be as close to the edge as you can manage. The closer they are, the larger your channel will be, and if you're not confident in that, you might want to add a little bit extra to the pattern to give yourself more space to work with at the beginning. Once those are done, it's just a matter of threading whatever you want to secure it through, and you're ready to find something to coordinate it with. And that's that. This is definitely the easier and the less fiddly of the 2 masks, and therefore the quicker to sew, but on the other hand it's less flexible as it needs to be sized correctly to fit well. This is definitely the one that I would rather sew, but the other one is the one that I would rather wear, and that will be coming out in 2 weeks. My question for you all today is, do you have anything that's reversible or can be switched out so that it can be used in more than one situation? Back in the day I used to have a pair of those trousers that had zips at the knees to turn them into shorts, but we do not talk about those. I hope this helped you out, and if it did, or if you enjoyed it, please think about giving me a like and subscribing if you're not already for more sewing and costume related content. Thanks to all of my subscribers and anyone who made it through to the end of the video. Stay safe, stay sensible, and I shall see you all again soon. Bye!